When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject: Long Haul. User: Free18WHL. Posted May 24th, 1997.
My dad once met Jimmy Hoffa at a Teamsters rally, and he used to say that after having us, it was the second proudest moment of his life. What Hoffa said, if you got it, truck brought it, made him feel good about driving a truck for a living, even if it wasn't always easy. He'd been driving rigs his entire life, and it had paid him enough to feed us and put a roof over our heads, but it also kept him away from home for days at a time. He had to miss our ball games, marching band performances, all that little stuff that adds up over a lifetime, and while he'd never say it, I believe trucking cost him his marriage with Mom, too, who left him for a handyman when I was just about old enough to start looking after my brothers and sisters. I tried to be other things, I really did, but Dad used to say that God makes farmers and fishermen, and I'm no farmer. My fondest memories from childhood were of being around his truck, having the smell of diesel burn my nostrils and bristle my tongue, and once I became den mother to my siblings, I knew there was no other way for me but the open road. I've been driving for 20 years now, and let me tell you, I have seen some sights. Sitting high up in the cab of a rig, you have a view of the world that the four-wheelers on the road just don't. When you're coming down a hill late at night and your headlights are turning a frosted-up apple tree into a kind of redneck disco ball, that's a good thing. When you wake up at night and hear someone talking to you, but you can plainly see there isn't a soul for a mile around, you're less excited about having the big chair. This story comes from an overnight at the Segovia stop on I-10, just east of Junction, Texas. I'd rolled in around 10:30, maybe half hour before the diner closed up, and had myself a chicken fried steak with gravy. I know, it's not good for you, but what is these days? My belly full, I climbed back into the sleeper in my cab for a little shut-eye. After my mom left, Dad knew that us boys would go crazy if we had too much downtime, so he found us some work with a furniture hauling company, doing grease and oil changes on their tractor trailers. We didn't have compressed air grease guns back then. Instead, we had to load them by hand, and it could be messy as hell. The differential oil, in particular, had a terrible sulfurous smell that stuck to you, and that night in the Segovia lot, I dreamed we were back in that truck depot, our hands covered in the stuff. In the dream, it was a hot summer's day, and somewhere in the distance I could hear a dog barking. The sulfur fumes were overpowering, and I started to feel lightheaded. I looked up toward my brother to see if he'd maybe spilled the can or something, and he was gone. The barking sound got louder as if the dog was getting closer. My dream self walked around the depot, which had emptied out at some point, the drivers and mechanics gone wherever my brother had, I supposed. The oil smell had increased to the point where it overwhelmed me completely, and I tried walking outside to the fresh air, but it stayed in my nostrils. Outside was just as empty as inside. The only sound was the barking, which was not distant anymore. Rather, it seemed to be coming from right around the corner of the truck farm, a crazy, gargling bark that didn't sound like any dog I knew. Despite myself, I began creeping toward the sound, curious to see if I could catch a glimpse of the dog without attracting its attention. In the silence of the yard, my boot crunching into gravel was particularly gunshot loud, and the dog responded in kind, its frenzied barking reaching new heights. Whatever it was that rounded the corner was no dog. It was pointed and bony and moved with terrifying speed. When I dropped out of the dream, I felt relief at being safe back in my sleeper. That relief was short-lived, however, because I could still smell that sulfur funk and hear barking. Gently, I parted the curtain, separating my sleeper from the cab, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Crouched on top of my engine, staring in through the windshield and barking like crazy, was a little boy. He couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, and he was wearing what looked like something Robin Hood would wear. I guess you'd call it a tunic, hanging way down over his knees. His face was filthy, covered in smears of brown and black, and his eyes were wild. They looked like slits, more snake than human. The whole image was so unlikely, so completely insane that I didn't know what to do. The boy wasn't hitting the windshield or anything, just barking. I parted the curtain more and he saw me, his barks giving way to a kind of high-pitched squeal. I nearly died driving a truck 6 or 7 times over the course of my career, but this was the only time I came close to messing myself. My head was still spinning from the sulfur smell and the unreality of the whole situation, but I gripped the front seat tight and pulled myself up, sitting down behind the wheel. The boy was still crouched in the same position, but now he was looking up toward the night sky, squealing in bursts. With his head up, I got a good look at the rest of him, his neck, his legs, his arms, and they were practically skeletal. They were so skinny. Being that we were on our own lot as kids, I'm tender on the subject of other kids being left in similar circumstances, but that night I didn't feel any sympathy for the boy on my hood. No, sir, I felt a revulsion like a fat, black cockroach had just crawled out of my spaghetti. I wanted to get gone, and now. I tapped on the windshield and the boy's head snapped towards me, his eyes sparkling. I told him he had to go, that I was going to drive off with him on the hood if he kept on, and all he did was give me this little smile that made my guts twist up. I shifted the truck into gear and it shuddered, making the kid lose his balance a little. He looked around quickly, almost animal-like, then dropped onto all fours and leapt off the hood to the passenger side. I couldn't see him anymore, but the barking was still there to keep me aware of his presence. Also, without him on the hood, I was able to get a good look at the truck stop parking lot, and it was almost full, but somehow none of this had attracted the attention of a single driver. I pushed the accelerator down further, heading toward the highway. In my passenger side mirror, I saw the bony boy again, still on all fours and barking. He was following me. The speedometer crept up and up as I got closer to the on-ramp, but still, that child kept pace, his bare hands and feet biting into the road dust and propelling him forward, barking all the while. I got up to 50 and he was still there, which shouldn't have been possible. His stick-like limbs were moving so fast they made him look like some kind of awful horse. Then, once my wheels hit the on-ramp, he just disappeared, like mist and sunrise. As I merged onto the interstate and brought the truck up to 60, it occurred to me that the sulfur smell was gone too. The miles dropped away, and before long, I started wondering if the whole thing hadn't been a nightmare. But a real good look at the hood stopped that right quick. There, just ahead of the vents below my windshield, was a muddy set of prints. 2 feet and 2 hands, like they'd been left intentionally. I don't know what I saw that night, but I do know that the smell of differential oil will never hit me the same way again.
Subject, the last haircut. User, 321SHK. Posted, October 10th, 1996.
My barber Ken has been operating out of the same location as long as I've been old enough to get my hair cut. I couldn't even begin to guess his age, but I'm 35, so logically he has to be at least in his 50s. He's been around long enough for me to watch the lines around his mouth and eyes deepen and his close-cropped red hair fade to an iron gray, but until recently, it never occurred to me that I don't know anything about him. He's always been affable in that way barbers are, but our conversations have always been limited to my life or the world at large. His shop has barely changed over the years, a small 10x10 wood-paneled room with 3 chairs, 2 for waiting and the big one in front of the mirror. I don't recall ever seeing any decorations except for a black and white photo of a smiling young girl tucked into the bottom of his mirror between his clippers and the blue jug of Barbicide. One time I tried asking if the girl was his daughter, but he just smiled at me and deftly redirected the conversation toward what the drillers had been up to. I was never one to turn down conversation about baseball, so that was the end of my questions about the girl in the photo. She wouldn't pass back into my mind until yesterday. Ken's hours have always been 11 to 8, Monday to Saturday year-round. Some days you'd even see him in the shop on his day off, sweeping or doing the books. Usually I'd try to catch him on Wednesdays an hour or so before closing, and that's when I got there last night as an orange October sunset was winding its way down to the horizon. If I stare at them too long, fall sunsets fill me with a melancholy that seeps all the way into my bones, like watching the final volley of fireworks explode at the county fair, knowing it means the long ride home isn't far away. The lights in the shop were on, but when I turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. There was a moment of dissonance while I checked my watch, then the hours on the door, as if the fading sign had somehow changed while I wasn't looking. A moment later, I saw the door to the back office open and Ken came out, his white smock as crisp as ever. He produced a key from one of his pockets, and I heard the doorknob click before it turned. "Michael," Ken said jovially as he opened the door. "Hey, Ken," I said, "is this a bad time?" "Not at all. You're my last customer of the day. I've been waiting for you. Come on in, son." He closed the door behind me, locking it and giving the doorknob a firm shake to make sure it stayed that way. I shuffled from one foot to the other. Not once in 30 years of haircuts had Ken ever closed early, and the thought gave me an unexpected anxiety. "Should I sit?" Of course. How are you, Michael? How are Annie and the girls?" I hung up my jacket on the hook behind the door and sat in the chair, watching both of us in the mirror. "They're good, thanks. I'm good too." Ken reached over top of me to put the apron in place. His aftershave, whatever it was, smelled exactly the same as the first day my mom had brought me here as a boy. For just a second, I felt that moment in time right next to me, as if it was a tangible thing that could be reached if you just stretched far enough. "Hey, Ken, what's up? You never close early." I looked at his face in the mirror and watched as multiple emotions passed across his lined face. There was sadness, regret, and something that looked like excitement. He sighed heavily and picked up the clippers. "I'm retiring, Michael. When I say you're my last customer, I mean it. After we're done here, I'm going to turn off the lights and lock the door. I'm sorry to say, you're going to have to find someone else to cut your hair from now on." I was dumbfounded. It was like finding out the sun was going to give up its day job. I fumbled for encouraging words. "Oh, wow. I mean, congratulations, Ken. That's great. Is this a recent decision?" The clippers buzzed the plastic teeth of the comb. No. I've known this was coming for a very long time. You might say my whole life has been building towards it." The question hung in the air for several moments while he finished with the clippers, gently placing them back on the counter. "To retirement?" I finally asked. "Isn't that the idea for all of us?" It wasn't a great joke, but Ken gave me a pity chuckle nonetheless. "Suppose you're right, Michael, but no, that's not what I mean." He picked up the scissors and used them to point toward the photograph on the mirror. "Have I ever told you about my sister Lucy?" I shook my head. "No, I suppose I wouldn't have. Sometimes I lose track of the conversations I've had with people in my head and the ones we've had in real life. I've always wanted to tell someone, but it's not an easy thing to hear, and I suppose I've also been afraid that if I told the wrong person, they might try to stop me doing what I need to do. Well, Michael, let me tell you about Lucy." He stepped behind me and began cutting my hair while he talked. "We grew up on a homestead near the Washita National Forest. Lucy was my younger sister, and I loved her very, very much. Our mother died giving birth to her, and my father always blamed Lucy for that. It wasn't fair, of course, but grief and fairness rarely have much to do with each other. I did what I could to protect Lucy from our father, but even I could only take so much. There were days he would beat me so badly with his belt that I could barely walk. On those days, I told Lucy to run, and she did, always to the forest. The forest was her safe haven." The entire time he was telling a story, Ken kept cutting my hair as precisely as ever, his voice neutral like he was rattling off box scores. One time, she was gone for 4 days, long enough the old man actually went looking for her. He looked for hours and hours, but in the end, she just wandered back home like no time had passed at all. When he came home and found her in the kitchen, making herself a butter sandwich, he lost his mind. It didn't matter that she somehow thought she'd actually only been gone a few hours, he still whipped her bloody. I was out at the far edge of the property doing chores and didn't know what was happening until it was too late. When I got home and saw her in that state, he trailed off, his eyes looking far beyond the shop windows. I swore I'd kill him. I told her that too as I cleaned her up and did what I could to bandage her wounds. To see what he'd done to her there aren't words for it. To me, it was like he'd spit in the face of God. I was furious and told her that I was going to wait until he had a skinful of booze in him, then take his head off with a shovel. It was just talk at the time, something to make myself feel better, but the more I said it, the more I wanted to do it. I wanted to feel the vibration as the spade hit his skull, the bite of the pitted wooden handle into my hands. Looking back, I guess I had a little of that old man's disease in me, that rage. Lucy begged me not to do it. She said that she'd found a place in the forest that was special, where time didn't pass like it did everywhere else. She really thought she'd only been gone a few hours instead of a few days. That she'd been going to this place for a little while now when Daddy had his fits, but that she'd never gone this far before. There was plenty of food there, fruit, mushrooms, berries, and bark, and somehow she just knew which ones to eat. She said that it was somewhere we could both go and hide a while, maybe forever. I didn't believe her, of course. Boys don't like to believe in magic because it means there's something more powerful than them out there, but Lucy kept talking about it, about how she'd found this place by accident because the grove you had to pass through to get in wasn't always there. She would explain to me how you got in, the angles you had to walk at and at what time of day, but I never listened, not really. My mind was fixed on repaying my father for the cruelty he'd done to her, not on what I thought were kids' games. There was another silence. Outside, the sun had dropped below the horizon and shadows gathered in the empty street. "What did you do?" Ken frowned. "I killed him, just the way I said I would." Lucy had been in the forest for a week at the time, and he wouldn't stop talking about what he was going to do when she came home. I couldn't let that happen, so I went out to the yard and found the heaviest shovel we had. One quick shot to the back of his head was all it took. It felt how I expected, the impact, the vibration, but there wasn't any catharsis to it. I didn't feel bad. He had been too cruel for that, but I didn't feel good either. The twitching bothered me most, his whole body spastically jerking on the ground like he was being electrocuted. It was disgusting, frankly, far more so than the blood pooling on the carpet. Just then, a pickup with a glass pack blew down the street, the souped-up muffler as loud as a cannon shot. We both jumped, startled out of our reverie, our fright followed by a mutual, nervous laugh. I hope you don't think less of me for telling you all this, Michael. I hadn't planned to, but when I saw you, I realized it might be my last chance to tell anyone. Ken, what you guys went through, I can't imagine what that must have been like. My father drank, but it was never like that. Living out in the boonies like that, I don't know what else you could have done short of run away. He nodded at me, his eyes meeting mine in the mirror. I suppose that's what I should have done. What happened after your dad? Did Lucy come home? His face clouded. Bad timing is what happened. The blood hadn't even begun to dry when a sheriff's cruiser pulled up outside. He wasn't even there on official business. He was going to buy some old equipment my father had posted up at the hardware store in town. It's almost funny looking back on it. Did he arrest you? Oh, yes. I was charged with second-degree murder and offered a 20-year sentence if I pled guilty. The district attorney at the time was a deeply conservative man who took a dim view of children raising their hands against their elders, even if they're badly treated. If I hadn't taken the plea, they were going to try for the death penalty. The injustice of it infuriated me. But you're a kid. There's no way they would have gone through with that. Ken shrugged. Maybe, maybe not, but I was just a young man and my lawyer advised me not to take the risk, so I listened. In the end, I served 15 years, in case you ever wondered where I learned to do this. At that, he lifted the scissors away from my head and gave him a wiggle in the mirror, their polish catching the overhead light. He winked and went back to cutting. What happened to Lucy? That's complicated. You see, when I was released, the only place I had to go was home. It had obviously been empty for years, and it was hard to see what it had become. Whatever couldn't be stolen was broken. I tried asking around, but 15 years is a long time. People move, people die. None of those who were left even remembered Lucy Cannell, never mind having seen her a decade ago. I stayed in the wreck of that house for weeks, trying to find some trace of her. Then, the night before I decided to leave, I dreamed about her. She looked a little older, though not 15 years older. She was wearing a beautiful patchwork of what looked like bits of moss and leaves and bark bound up in strips of cloth. It was like something out of the Swiss Family Robinson, but she looked right at home in it. In the dream, Lucy led me over to the fireplace and pointed to a partially burned up scrap of paper that had fluttered loose when some drifter at last lit a fire in what was left of our home. When I woke up, I cried and cried, but when I went into the den and looked at the fireplace, I could see exactly that scrap of paper wedged between the bricks that lined the bottom. It was a blue-eyed miracle that it hadn't gone up entirely. What did it say? Ken smiled, his eyes a million miles away. It was from her. She'd written it 5 years before. She told me that she wished I hadn't done what I did, not because our father didn't deserve it, but because it left her all alone. God, I felt guilty about that, Michael. Anger makes you feel powerful, but it's an illusion. It's a disease that feeds on goodness and leaves regret in its wake. He was silent again for a few minutes, and I realized he had finished cutting my hair. Is that all it said? Ken picked up his brush and started running it through my hair to shake out the strays. No, she said she'd be waiting for me in the forest. She even wrote down how to get there. Did you go? He stopped brushing. His face was turned away from me, but his voice was thick. I did not. Prison had turned me into a very different person than the boy she knew, and I was afraid she wouldn't be able to love me the same. I suppose I had idealized her. I left for the city that very day. Eventually, I opened this shop here, and the rest, you know. With a flourish, he pulled the apron off me, shaking loose hairs onto the tiled floor. I stood up. His eyes were moist, but there were no tears. So, your retirement, you're going to find her? He nodded. Why now? I'm 65 years old, Michael. I'm still in relatively good health, mobile, but how long will it stay that way? Whether it's 5 years or 20, at some point, I won't be able to hike out into those woods anymore to find the angles I need to open the door. You really believe this place exists? I do. And even if it didn't, I'd still go. I would trade every remaining year in my life for the possibility of another day with the only family I've ever known. I thought back to the memory of my mother. If I didn't have Annie and the girls, what would I have given for one more new day with her? Ken refused to take my money for the haircut, and we said our goodbyes. I was halfway out the door when he called my name. I turned back to look at him for the last time. He was standing in the doorframe of the office, his white smock and hair glowing in the fluorescent lights. Yeah, Ken? You were always a good boy, Michael, and I want you to know I'm proud of the man you become. Give my best to Annie, okay? Tears pricked at the corner of my eyes. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I nodded. Ken smiled at me again, then stepped into the office, closing the door behind him.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.